The silence stretched between predator and prey, broken only by the relentless howl of wind through the mountain peaks. Cassius stood frozen above the collapsed woman, his pale fingers trembling, not from cold, for he had not felt such mortal discomfort in centuries, but from the impossible recognition coursing through his veins. That heartbeat. Ancient. Powerful. Familiar. He should have already drained her dry, should have left her bones to bleach in the spring thaw, alongside countless others who had dared traverse his territory. Instead, he found himself kneeling in the snow, his predatory instincts warring with something far more dangerous, curiosity. Alara's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. She looked up at him through snow-crusted lashes, taking in his otherworldly beauty with the detached acceptance of someone who had already surrendered to death. His skin was marble pale, stretched over aristocratic features that belonged in Renaissance paintings. Dark hair fell across his brow, and his eyes, God help her, his eyes were the deep crimson of fresh blood. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Not the baby." Cassius tilted his head, studying her with the predatory grace of a wolf examining wounded deer. In her condition, she should be terrified. Instead, she watched him with an eerie calmness, as if she had gazed upon monsters before and found them wanting compared to the human devils she had known. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old European nobility wrapped in velvet menace. "These lands have been mine for longer than your mortal mind could comprehend." "Then kill me quickly." Alara's hand moved protectively over her swollen belly. "But spare the child, please. It's done nothing wrong." The plea should have amused him. How many had begged for mercy over the centuries? How many had offered bargains, bribes, their very souls? He had listened to none of them. Mercy was a luxury he had abandoned along with his mortality. But that heartbeat continued its impossible rhythm, and with each pulse, memories stirred in the darkest corners of his mind. Fragments of prophecies whispered in dead languages, of power that could reshape the supernatural world, of a child born under specific circumstances who would either save or damn them all. "What are you running from?" The question surprised him as much as her. Since when did he engage in conversation with his meals? "My husband." The words came out cracked and broken. Lord Edmund Whitmore. When he learned the child might not be his. She couldn't finish, but the bruises visible, even in the dim moonlight, told their own story. Cassius felt something stir in his chest, an emotion so foreign he almost couldn't name it. Rage, not the cold fury of a predator defending territory, but something hotter, more personal, the concept of a man brutalizing a pregnant woman, awakened instincts he thought had died with his humanity. Might not be his? He leaned closer, inhaling her scent. Human, yes, but underneath lay something else, something that made his supernatural senses hum with electricity. "I don't know how to explain it." Alara struggled to sit up, snow falling from her dark hair. "The child, sometimes I feel it moving, and it's like lightning in my veins." The midwife crossed herself and spoke of old magic. Edmund became convinced I had lain with demons. If only he knew how close to the truth he was. Cassius stood abruptly, pacing a tight circle around her prone form. In the distance, his castle loomed against the storm-dark sky, its Gothic spires clawing at the clouds. He had ruled from those towers for 3 centuries, a solitary predator who answered to no one. His existence was perfectly ordered: hunt, feed, retreat to his books and solitude, until hunger drove him out again. This woman, this mortal, threatened that carefully constructed isolation. "You'll die out here," he stated flatly. "I know. The cold will claim you within the hour, better than what awaits me if Edmund finds me." Another pulse of that impossible heartbeat, and Cassius felt his world tilt on its axis. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let nature take its course. He owed nothing to mortals, had taken everything from them for centuries. But prophecies were not to be ignored, especially by creatures who had lived long enough to see them fulfilled. And if this child was what he suspected, "Can you walk?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Hope flickered in Alara's eyes, quickly suppressed. I think so." "Why?" Cassius extended one pale hand, his expression unreadable. "Because, Mrs. Whitmore, it seems your death would be inconvenient for us both." As her fingers touched his, that strange energy pulsed between them, and Cassius Blackthorne, vampire lord and apex predator, realized his 300 years of carefully ordered existence had just come to an end. The storm raged on, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy staring at each other, predator and prey, both sensing that this moment would echo through eternity. The storm followed them to his castle like a living thing, battering the ancient stones with ice and fury. Cassius moved through the corridors with practiced silence, Alara's unconscious form cradled against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. The moment her exhaustion had claimed her during their trek through the snow, he had lifted her without thought, surprised by the protective instinct that had seized him. Now, as he settled her in the guest chamber, a room that had remained unused for decades, he found himself studying the disruption she represented to his carefully ordered world. Castle Ravencrest had been his domain since 1547, when he had claimed it from a Wallachian boyar who had made the mistake of trying to hunt vampires for sport. Every stone, every shadow, every secret passage had been arranged to serve his solitary existence. The servants were few and bound by supernatural compulsion to silence and discretion. They maintained his library, prepared his correspondence, and asked no questions about the crimson stains that sometimes marked his clothing upon his return from the hunt. Cassius descended to his study, his footsteps echoing in the vaulted halls. The familiar ritual of his evening routine should have restored his equilibrium, but instead he found himself pacing restlessly among the towering bookshelves. Ancient tomes lined the walls, grimoires bound in leather that had once been human skin, treatises on blood magic penned by long-dead sorcerers, chronicles of the vampire courts that had ruled Europe's shadows for millennia. This was his world. Knowledge and power accumulated over 3 centuries of existence. He corresponded with scholars across the continent, though they knew him only as an eccentric nobleman with an extensive private library. He had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had fed upon kings and peasants alike with equal dispassion. His existence was one of perfect predatory order. Until tonight. Cassius pulled a leather-bound journal from his desk drawer, one of dozens that chronicled his centuries of unlife. The entries were methodical, recording his hunts with the precision of a natural philosopher documenting specimens, names if he had learned them, the quality of their blood, how long they had lasted before the life fled their eyes. It was a catalogue of death that stretched back 300 years. He opened to a fresh page, his pale fingers hovering over the quill. But instead of recording tonight's intended hunt, he found himself writing about silver eyes and impossible heartbeats, about prophecies half-remembered, and the way mortal terror had been replaced by something far more dangerous, hope. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Gorga, his most trusted servant, entered with the deferential silence that centuries of service had perfected. "The woman, my lord." The old Romanian's voice carried no judgment. He had seen stranger guests in Cassius's domain, though admittedly few had arrived alive and remained so. "She is to be given every comfort," Cassius replied, his crimson eyes never leaving the journal. "Fresh clothing when she wakes, food, whatever she requires. And how long shall she be staying?" The question hung in the air like incense. In 300 years, Cassius had never sheltered a mortal for longer than it took to drain them dry. His castle was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb that happened to house a living occupant. "I don't know." The admission felt like a crack in his foundations. Gorga bowed and withdrew, leaving Cassius alone with his increasingly chaotic thoughts. Through the tall windows, he could see the storm still raging across his mountain domain. By morning, the roads would be impassable for weeks. Even if he wanted to rid himself of his unexpected guest, winter itself had made that choice for him. He should have left her in the snow. should have followed 3 centuries of instinct and taken what her veins offered before abandoning her corpse to the wolves. Instead, she lay sleeping in his castle, carrying a child whose very heartbeat seemed to mock everything he believed about the natural order. Cassius moved to his collection of ancient prophecies, pulling volume after volume from their resting places. Somewhere in these pages lay references to the child he suspected grew within Ilara's womb, a being of power that would reshape the delicate balance between the mortal and supernatural worlds. The vampire courts had whispered of such prophecies for centuries, dismissing them as folklore. But folklore had a way of bleeding into reality when one lived long enough to see the impossible become inevitable. As dawn approached, Cassius felt the familiar lethargy that came with sunrise settling into his bones. Soon he would retreat to his chambers, to the reinforced darkness that protected him from the sun's lethal touch. But first, he found himself climbing the stairs to check on his guest, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name. Ilara slept peacefully, her dark hair spread across white pillows like spilled ink. In sleep, the haunted terror had left her face, replaced by something that might have been serenity. Her hand rested protectively over her swollen belly, and even through the stone walls, Cassius could hear it, that impossible heartbeat that had stopped him from claiming his rightful prey. For the first time in 3 centuries, Lord Cassius Blackthorn went to his rest uncertain whether he was predator or protector, and the distinction terrified him more than silver or sunlight ever could. Cassius had barely closed his eyes when the screaming began. Not the mortal cries he had grown accustomed to echoing through his halls, the final gasps of prey realizing their fate. This was something else entirely. A sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality, piercing the reinforced stone of his chambers with supernatural clarity. He was moving before consciousness fully returned, his body responding to instincts honed over 3 centuries of survival. The lethargy of dawn still clung to his limbs, but adrenaline, an emotion he had thought lost to his transformation, burned it away like acid. The screaming came from Ilara's chamber. Cassius burst through the door to find her writhing on the bed, her hands clutched over her swollen belly as if trying to hold something inside. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only white, and when she screamed again, the very windows rattled in their frames. But it was not pain that froze him in the doorway. It was the power radiating from her prone form, waves of energy that made his supernatural senses shriek in alarm. The air around her shimmered like heat mirages, and he could taste copper and lightning on his tongue. "My lord," Gorga appeared behind him, the old servant's face pale with terror. "The entire castle shakes. What?" His words died as Ilara's eyes snapped open, revealing not the storm-grey irises Cassius remembered, but orbs of pure silver light. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that belonged to no mortal throat. "They come, the Ancient Ones stir. The child's presence calls to them across the void." The prophetic words hit Cassius like physical blows. In 300 years of studying supernatural lore, he had read accounts of oracular possession, but witnessing it was another matter entirely. Power rolled off Ilara in waves, and he realized with growing horror that every supernatural creature within 100 miles would sense this disturbance, would be drawn to it like moths to flame. "The courts of night shall bow or burn. The silver throne shall rise from ashes of the old order. But first they come to claim what was promised in blood and shadow." As suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. Ilara collapsed back against the pillows, her eyes returning to their natural color, confusion replacing supernatural awareness. "Cassius? What? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" He might have laughed at the irony if terror hadn't been clawing at his throat. In the distance, carried on the wind that still howled around his mountain stronghold, came the sound that confirmed his worst fears. Howling. Not wolves, something far more intelligent and infinitely more dangerous. "Gorga," Cassius commanded, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. "Secure the castle. Every ward, every barrier. Nothing enters without my permission. My lord, what approaches?" The howling came again, closer now, and with it the unmistakable sensation of hunger. Not the simple need for sustenance that drove vampires like himself, but the cosmic appetite of beings far older than civilization. "The Shadowkin," Cassius whispered, the words tasting like ash. "The prophecy speaks true. Her child's power calls to the ancient courts." Elara struggled to sit up, her face pale but determined. "I don't understand. What prophecy? What's happening to my baby?" Through the tall windows, Cassius could see shapes moving in the storm, forms that defied natural law, flowing like liquid shadow between the trees. The Shadowkin had not stirred from their deep lairs in over 2 centuries, but the child's power had awakened them from their slumber. They had come to claim what they believed was theirs by right. "Your child," Cassius said slowly, his mind racing through centuries of accumulated knowledge, "is not entirely human. The power I sensed, the way it calls to supernatural creatures, it's been prophesied for millennia. A being born of mortal woman, but touched by forces beyond this realm. That's impossible." "Is it?" He moved to the window, watching the shadows gather at the edge of his domain. "You said yourself the midwife spoke of old magic. Your husband suspected demonic influence. What if you both were closer to the truth than you realized?" The howling rose to a crescendo, and Cassius felt the ancient wards around his castle strain under supernatural pressure. They would hold. He had layered them over centuries of careful preparation, but not indefinitely. The Shadowkin were patient creatures, willing to lay siege for years if necessary. He turned back to Elara, seeing his own realization reflected in her widening eyes. She understood, perhaps better than she wanted to, that her child was no ordinary being, that the power growing within her womb had marked them both for attention from forces that viewed mortals as little more than amusing pets. "What do they want?" she whispered. "To serve the child, if it proves worthy. To devour it, if it does not." Cassius moved away from the window, his expression grim. The prophecies speak of a silver throne, of power that could unite or shatter the supernatural courts. Your child could become either salvation or apocalypse. Another wave of howling echoed through the night, and Cassius faced the choice that would define whatever remained of his existence. He could surrender Elara to the Shadowkin, return to his carefully ordered solitude, and pretend this night had never happened. Or he could stand against creatures older than empires to protect a woman and child who represented everything his predatory nature should despise. The distinction between predator and protector had never felt more absolute or more terrifying. Cassius stood frozen in the candlelit chamber, the weight of centuries pressing down upon him like a physical force. The Shadowkin's howling had faded to a distant murmur, but their presence lingered at the edges of his consciousness, patient predators waiting for weakness to reveal itself. He had faced armies, had stood against vampire lords who commanded legions of the undead, had walked through plague-ravaged cities where death hung thick as morning fog. But this choice, this moment, terrified him in ways that transcended his supernatural nature. "What am I doing?" The thought echoed through his mind as he watched Elara struggle to process the impossible truth of her situation. 300 years of careful isolation, of predatory certainty, crumbled around him like ancient parchment. He had built his existence on simple principles. Take what he needed, trust no one, survive at any cost. Compassion was a luxury that had died with his mortality. Yet here he stood, contemplating war against creatures older than memory, for a mortal woman, whose only claim on him was the impossible heartbeat growing in her womb. "You could still walk away." The words slipped out unbidden, and he realized with horror that he was speaking to himself as much as to her. Elara's grey eyes met his, and he saw in them a reflection of his own terror. "Could you?" The question hit him like silver through the heart. Could he abandon her now? Could he return to his books and blood, pretending this night had never shattered his carefully ordered world? The logical answer, Screamades. He owed nothing to mortals, had spent centuries proving that fundamental truth. But prophecies were not logical things. and the power radiating from her unborn child had awakened something in him that felt dangerously close to purpose. Cassius moved to the fireplace, his pale hands gripping the stone mantel until his knuckles turned white. Behind him he could hear Ilara's labored breathing, smell the fear sweat that had replaced her earlier exhaustion. She waited for his decision with the patience of someone who had learned that survival often depended on the whims of more powerful creatures. The vampire courts will never forgive this defiance. The thought brought a bitter smile to his lips. For 3 centuries he had maintained careful neutrality among the supernatural powers, too dangerous to eliminate, too useful to alienate. His library contained secrets that could topple kingdoms of shadow, and his mountain fortress had served as neutral ground for negotiations between ancient enemies. All of that would end the moment he chose protection over predation. "Do you understand what you're asking of me?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "The forces gathering beyond these walls, they're not bandits or angry husbands. They're older than human civilization, patient as stone, hungry as the void between stars." "I didn't ask for any of this," Ilara whispered. "I just wanted my baby to live." The simple honesty of her words cut through his supernatural defenses like a blade. Here was a mortal woman, exhausted and terrified, facing powers beyond her comprehension with nothing but maternal instinct as armor. She should have been easy prey, wounded, isolated, dependent on his mercy. Instead, she had become the catalyst for his complete transformation. Cassius closed his eyes, remembering the weight of sword and shield from his mortal life. He had been a knight once, in an age when honor meant something more than empty words, before the vampire who sired him had torn away everything human and left only hunger in its place. Sir Cassius of House Blackthorn, sworn to protect the innocent. The memory struck him like lightning, bringing with it a rush of emotions he thought had been burned away by centuries of blood and darkness. He had knelt before an altar once, had sworn oaths that seemed naive and foolish now, but beneath the weight of his vampiric nature, those vows still echoed. Protect the innocent. Defend those who cannot defend themselves. "The child will be hunted for its entire existence," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every supernatural court will seek to claim it, control it, or destroy it. There will be no peace, no normal life. Only constant vigilance against forces that view mortals as livestock. Then why are you considering this madness?" He turned to face her, and in that moment saw not prey but something far more dangerous, hope incarnate. The child's heartbeat pulsed between them, that impossible rhythm that had stopped him from claiming his natural due. "Because," Cassius said slowly, the words feeling like confession, "for the first time in 3 centuries, I remember what it felt like to be human." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the gap between predator and protector. Outside, the Shadowkin stirred restlessly, sensing the momentous choice taking shape within the castle walls. Cassius Blackthorn, vampire lord and apex predator, stood on the precipice of transformation, terrified of both the fall and the flight it might require. The distinction between damnation and salvation had never felt thinner. The words hung between them like an incantation, transforming the very air of the chamber. Cassius felt something fundamental shift within his chest, not his heart, which had ceased beating 3 centuries ago, but something deeper. The last threads of his old existence, the careful predatory distance he had maintained from all mortal concerns, snapped like overworn silk. There would be no return from this moment. "Then we are both mad," Ilara whispered, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "Because I choose to trust a monster to protect my child." The irony might have amused him once. Now it felt like absolution. Cassius moved with sudden purpose, centuries of strategic thinking crystallizing into action. "Gorga." His voice carried the authority of ancient nobility and supernatural power combined. "Bring my weapons, all of them." The old servant appeared in the doorway, his weathered face etched with concern. "My lord?" "The armory. Every blade, every wardstone, every artifact I've collected over the centuries." Cassius turned to face the storm-lashed windows, where shadows moved with predatory patience. If the Shadowkin want war, they shall have it. Understanding dawned in Gorg's eyes, along with something that might have been pride. The old man had served House Blackthorn since before Cassius's transformation, had watched his young lord die and rise again as something terrible. But perhaps, in this moment, he glimpsed the knight who had once existed beneath the monster. At once, my lord. Gorg bowed and departed with renewed vigor. Elara struggled to sit up straighter, her grey eyes wide with a mixture of terror and determination. What are you planning? Survival, Cassius replied simply. Yours, mine, and your child's. The Shadowkin respect only strength and ancient law. If I declare formal protection over you both, blood oath, binding by the old covenants, they cannot simply take what they desire. And if they refuse to honor such laws... His smile held no warmth, only the promise of violence honed over 3 centuries. Then we discover whether a vampire lord's fangs can tear shadows. The howling rose again beyond the walls, closer now, testing the boundaries of his domain. Cassius could feel them probing his defenses, ancient wards laid down in the early years of his unlife when paranoia and power had seemed like adequate substitutes for purpose. Now those same protections would serve a cause he had never imagined, sheltering new life instead of ending it. There's something else you must understand, he continued, moving to where heavy curtains blocked the pre-dawn light. The moment I swear this oath, I become more than your protector. In supernatural law, I become bound to your child as if I were bloodkin. Its enemies become mine, its fate becomes mine. Why? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Why would you bind yourself to strangers? Cassius paused, his pale fingers resting against the window frame. Through the glass he could see his reflection, marble-white skin, crimson eyes that glowed with unnatural light, features frozen forever in aristocratic perfection. He looked exactly like what he was, a creature of shadow and hunger, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. But for the first time in 3 centuries, the reflection felt like a lie. Because, he said slowly, the words drawn from some deep well he had thought long dry, I have spent 300 years taking life. Perhaps it is time to learn what it means to preserve it instead. The admission cost him more than blood or silver ever could. He was crossing a threshold from which there could be no retreat, abandoning the cold certainty of predation for something far more dangerous and indefinite. Love, perhaps, or redemption, or simply the desperate hope that monsters might still find grace. Outside, the storm began to subside, but the supernatural tempest was only beginning. The Shadowkin would not withdraw at the first sign of resistance. Other courts would learn of the child's existence, would send their own representatives to claim or destroy what they could not control. His mountain fortress would become a battleground between forces that had shaped the hidden world for millennia, and at the center of it all would be a mortal woman and her impossible child. 2 fragile lives that now meant more to him than his own continued existence. Gorga returned, his arms laden with weapons that sang with old power. Silver-edged blades blessed by forgotten saints, wardstones carved from meteoric iron, artifacts won in battles against creatures whose names were whispered only in the deepest libraries of the supernatural courts. Shall I prepare the ritual chamber, my lord? The old servant asked. Cassius nodded, understanding the weight of the choice before him. Once spoken, a vampire's blood oath could not be broken except by death. He would be bound to Elara and her child until the sun burned cold or his enemies finally claimed him. It should have felt like a chain. Instead, it felt like freedom. Yes, he said, his voice carrying the finality of centuries. It is time. The ritual chamber lay deep within the castle's foundation, carved from living rock and older than the mortal kingdoms that had risen and fallen above it. Gorg led them through corridors lined with tapestries depicting battles between creatures that existed only in mankind's darkest nightmares, his torch casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life. Elara leaned heavily against Cassius's arm, her breathing labored but determined. Each step echoed with supernatural weight, as if the stones themselves recognized the gravity of what was to come. The child within her stirred restlessly, its heartbeat growing stronger as they descended, as if it too sensed the approaching convergence of ancient powers. "The Shadowkin have not moved," Gorga reported quietly, his weathered hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. "They wait at the forest's edge, just beyond the primary wards. They know what I intend," Cassius replied, his crimson eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "Blood oaths cannot be hidden from creatures of their age. They taste the intention in the air itself." The chamber opened before them like a cathedral of shadow and stone. Symbols carved by forgotten civilizations spiraled across the walls, their meanings lost to all but the most ancient of beings. At the center stood an altar of black marble, its surface worn smooth by centuries of supernatural rituals. Candles arranged in precise geometric patterns provided the only illumination, their flames burning with colors that had no names in mortal tongues. Cassius felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. How many oaths had been sworn in this place? How many souls had been bound or broken upon that altar? He had performed rituals here before, darker ceremonies that had expanded his power and deepened his isolation from anything resembling humanity. This would be different. This would be salvation or damnation, with no middle ground between. "Are you certain?" He turned to Elara, searching her pale face for any hint of doubt. "Once begun, this cannot be undone. Your fate and mine will be intertwined until death claims us both." She met his gaze without flinching, and he saw in her grey eyes the same desperate courage that had carried her through snowstorms and abusive marriage alike. "My child deserves a chance at life. If you're willing to provide that chance, then yes, I'm certain." The howling began again outside, closer now, testing the boundaries of his domain with increased boldness. The Shadowkin grew impatient, sensing the approaching ritual that would place Elara and her child beyond their immediate reach. Their ancient hunger pressed against the castle walls like a physical force. Cassius drew one of the silver-blessed blades, its edge gleaming with holy light that should have burned his undead flesh. Instead, it felt strangely warm in his palm, as if recognizing the righteousness of his purpose. The irony was not lost on him, a vampire wielding blessed silver to protect rather than destroy. "Gorga, monitor the outer defenses. Signal me if the Shadowkin attempt direct assault." "My lord." The old servant bowed and withdrew, leaving them alone in the chamber where supernatural law would reshape their destinies. Cassius positioned Elara beside the altar, then raised the blessed blade above his palm. The words of binding rose from memory 3 centuries deep, learned in an age when such oaths carried the weight of divine judgment. His voice echoed through the chamber with power that made the very stones vibrate in harmonic response. "By blood freely given, by choice made in full knowledge of consequence, I bind myself to thee." The blade parted his flesh without resistance, and crimson drops fell upon the black marble like rubies against midnight. "Your enemies become mine. Your protection becomes my sacred charge. Your child's welfare becomes the measure of my honor." Power rushed through the chamber like storm winds made visible. The carved symbols blazed with sudden light, and somewhere in the distance, the Shadowkin howled in frustrated rage as they felt the binding take hold. Ancient law now stood between them and their quarry, law that even creatures of their age could not simply ignore. But as the ritual's energy peaked, new presences stirred at the edges of Cassius's supernatural awareness. The blood oath had created ripples that extended far beyond his mountain domain, alerting other powers to the child's existence and his protection of it. They come, he realized with growing horror, all of them, from the eastern valleys, something that might once have been called angels, but had fallen so far that darkness was their natural element. From the southern peaks, lycanthrope clans whose loyalty could be bought with promises of power. From the northern wastes, necromancers who viewed prophecy as an opportunity to reshape the very nature of death itself. The child's birth would not merely herald a new age, it would trigger a supernatural war that could span continents. As the binding ritual reached completion, Cassius faced a terrifying truth. Protecting Ilara and her child would require allies as formidable as the enemies gathering against them. He would need to forge alliances with creatures he had spent centuries avoiding, trust beings whose nature was as predatory as his own. The game had only begun. The power of the blood oath settled into the very foundations of the castle like a living thing, thrumming through stone and timber with each beat of the prophesied child's heart. Cassius stood motionless beside the altar, his supernatural senses stretched to their limits as he catalogued the approaching threats. What he felt made his centuries of experience seem woefully inadequate. "How long do we have?" Ilara's voice cut through his grim calculations, her hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly. "Hours, perhaps less." He moved to the chamber's eastern wall, where ancient scrying stones had been embedded in the rock. With a gesture, they flared to life, revealing glimpses of the forces converging on his mountain domain. The Shadowkin were merely the first wave. Others have felt the ritual's resonance. The stones showed glimpses that would have driven mortal minds to madness, beings of shadow and flame moving through winter forests with predatory grace, their forms shifting between human and something far more terrible. Ancient lycanthropes whose very presence withered the snow beneath their feet. Things that wore the faces of angels, but carried the stench of sulfur and corruption. "All converging here," Cassius murmured, his crimson eyes reflecting the scrying stone's eldritch light. "Drawn by your child's power like moths to flame." Ilara moved closer, her mortality a stark contrast to the supernatural energies crackling through the chamber. "Can your defenses hold against all of them?" The question struck at the heart of his deepest fears. The castle's wards were formidable, layered protections built over 3 centuries of careful preparation, but they had been designed to repel individual threats, not the coordinated assault of multiple supernatural courts. Against such overwhelming force, even his mountain fortress would eventually fall. Not indefinitely. The admission tasted like ash. "We need allies. Creatures powerful enough to balance the scales against our enemies. You speak as if such allies exist." Cassius turned from the scrying stones, his expression grim, with memories of wars fought in the hidden spaces between mortal perception. "They exist. The question is whether they can be trusted and what price they will demand for their aid." He moved to an ornate desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface covered with maps that showed more than geography, ley lines and convergence points, the hidden highways that supernatural creatures use to traverse vast distances. His pale fingers traced routes that connected his domain to seats of power scattered across the continent. "The Court of Mirrors in Prague," he murmured, considering options that grew more distasteful with each passing moment. They despise the Shadowkin, but their price for aid typically involves centuries of servitude. The witching covens of the Black Forest might honor old debts, but they view prophecies as raw material for their own designs. His finger moved to another location, another potential ally who might prove as dangerous as the enemies they faced. What about others like yourself? Other vampires who might... No. The word emerged with such finality that the chamber's candles flickered. "The vampire courts see your child as either a tool to be claimed or a threat to be eliminated. My protection oath has already marked me as traitor to their cause." Ilara sank into a chair beside the obsidian desk, exhaustion warring with determination in her grey eyes. "Then we're truly alone." The defeat in her voice cut through his supernatural defenses more effectively than silver or holy water ever could. Here was a mortal woman, facing forces beyond her comprehension, trusting a monster to preserve what she held most dear. The weight of that trust felt heavier than all his centuries of accumulated guilt. "Not alone," he said quietly, the words carrying a conviction that surprised him. "Isolated, perhaps, outnumbered, certainly, but not alone." Gorge's voice echoed through the stone corridors, urgent with news that could reshape their desperate situation. "My lord." Riders approach from the western pass. Cassius moved to the chamber's main entrance, his supernatural hearing picking up the thunder of hoofbeats across frozen ground. Not the inhuman gait of Shadowkin, but something else, something that rode rather than stalked through the winter darkness. More enemies? Ilara struggled to her feet, one hand gripping the chair for support. Unknown. He drew one of the blessed blades, its silver edge singing with anticipation, but anything approaching in the midst of this supernatural convergence bears investigation. They ascended through the castle's winding passages, past chambers where artifacts of power hummed with barely contained energy. The very air seemed charged with potential violence, as if the building itself prepared for siege. Gorg waited in the main hall, his weathered face etched with concern and something that might have been hope. "They bear the banner of House Ravencrest, my lord. The Dampier House." Cassius felt something shift in his chest, not quite relief, but a lessening of the crushing certainty of defeat. House Ravencrest, half-vampire nobles, who walked the line between mortal and supernatural worlds, their mixed heritage making them outcasts among both human and vampire societies. Outcasts, perhaps, but formidable allies for those desperate enough to trust them. "Lower the drawbridge," he commanded, "but maintain defensive positions. Desperation makes strange bedfellows, but it does not guarantee their loyalty." The game of supernatural politics was about to become far more complex. The massive drawbridge descended with the grinding protest of ancient chains, each link forged in an age when such mechanisms were built to withstand siege engines and supernatural assault alike. Cassius stood in the main hall's towering archway, blessed blade still gleaming in his grasp, as the riders of House Ravencrest crossed the threshold into his domain. 7 figures emerged from the swirling snow, their horses breathing steam that carried the metallic scent of barely restrained violence. At their head rode a woman whose beauty struck like a physical blow, alabaster skin marked by veins of silver that pulsed with Dampier vitality, raven-black hair that moved as if stirred by winds from otherworldly realms, and eyes that shifted between human blue and predatory gold, depending on the angle of torchlight. Lady Seraphina Ravencrest. He had not seen her in 50 years, not since their last encounter had ended with blood spilled and oaths broken in the shadow of Prague's supernatural courts. "Cassius!" Her voice carried the musical cadence of noble breeding, layered over something far more primal. "You've been busy making enemies of late." The Dampier riders dismounted with fluid grace, their movements betraying the deadly synthesis of vampire speed and human adaptability that made their kind so feared. Each bore weapons that gleamed with silver inlay, blessed steel that could wound both mortal and supernatural foes with equal efficiency. Their mixed heritage allowed them to wield such sanctified armaments without the burning agony that would cripple a full vampire. "Seraphina." He inclined his head with the bare minimum of courtesy required by ancient protocol. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this unexpected visit?" Her laugh rang through the hall like breaking crystal. Still the diplomat, even when facing annihilation. "The supernatural courts are in uproar, Cassius. Word spreads that the great Lord Blackthorn has sworn protection over a mortal woman carrying something that makes even the Elder Council nervous." Behind him, Ilara's sharp intake of breath betrayed her recognition of the broader implications. If word had reached the Dampier courts this quickly, then every supernatural power across the continent would soon know of the child's existence and his protection oath. "The Shadowkin mass at your borders," Seraphina continued, her hybrid nature allowing her to sense threats that existed in multiple realms simultaneously. "But they are merely the vanguard. Others come, things that view prophecy as either opportunity or abomination." Cassius felt the weight of his greatest fear crystallizing into terrible certainty. Everything he had learned about supernatural politics, every alliance and enmity forged across 3 centuries of existence, would be tested in the crucible of this convergence. The child's birth would not merely fulfill prophecy, it would shatter the delicate balance of power that had governed the hidden world for millennia. "You offer aid?" He kept his voice carefully neutral, remembering too well the price of trusting Dampier nobility. "Or do you come to claim what others seek?" Seraphina stepped closer, and he caught the scent that marked her hybrid nature. Roses and iron, beauty and blood intertwined. "I offer a proposition. House Ravencrest has no love for the Elder Council's machinations, nor do we bow to Shadowkin demands. Your protection oath has created opportunities for those wise enough to seize them. At what cost? Her smile revealed teeth slightly too sharp for humanity, a reminder that Dhampir blood carried its own hungers. When the child is born, when its true nature is revealed, we stand together against whatever forces seek to claim or destroy it. In exchange, House Ravencrest gains considerations in the new order that will surely emerge. The offer hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Alliance with the Dhampir would provide formidable protection. Their mixed heritage made them uniquely suited to battle creatures from multiple supernatural realms. But their loyalty came with strings that could prove as binding as any curse. The decision is not mine alone. Cassius turned to Alara, whose grey eyes held a wisdom born of desperate circumstances. The child is yours. Its fate should not be determined by my choices alone. Alara studied Seraphina with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in human faces and must now extend that skill to beings far more complex. What guarantee do we have of your protection? What stops you from betraying us when a better offer emerges? Seraphina's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been respect beneath the predatory calculation. Dhampir honor, mortal woman. We who exist between worlds understand the value of sanctuary better than most. She drew a blade whose silver surface bore inscriptions in languages that predated written history. I offer blood oath, as your protector has done. House Ravencrest bound to your child's welfare until death claims us all. The blade parted her palm, and blood, the color of liquid starlight, fell upon the stone floor. Where it struck, the ancient symbols carved into the castle's foundation blazed with renewed power, recognizing the oath's validity. But as supernatural energies swirled through the hall, Cassius felt new presences stirring at the very edges of perception, forces drawn by the convergence of oaths and prophecy like predators to wounded prey. The ordeal had only begun. The blazing symbols had scarcely faded when the first assault began. It came not as Cassius had anticipated, not the calculated advance of Shadowkin forces or the political maneuvering of vampire courts, but as something far more primal and devastating. The ancient wards that had protected his mountain fortress for 3 centuries simply collapsed. The failure was instantaneous and total, like a dam bursting under impossible pressure. Waves of malevolent energy crashed through the castle's foundations, seeking the source of the prophetic power that had drawn them across continents. Cassius staggered as the psychic backlash tore through his consciousness, his vampire senses overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of supernatural forces converging on his domain. Impossible, he gasped, crimson eyes wide with disbelief. The wards were layered, reinforced. Against individual threats, Seraphina's voice cut through his shock like a blade. Not against the combined will of every supernatural court on the continent working in unprecedented coordination. Through the shattered remnants of his scrying network, glimpses of truth filtered into Cassius's horrified awareness. The approaching forces had not come as separate factions seeking to claim or destroy the prophesied child. They had come as a unified army, their ancient rivalries temporarily set aside in the face of a threat that transcended their individual ambitions. The Elder Council's crimson banners flew alongside Shadowkin war standards. Lycanthrope pack leaders ran beside creatures that had once been angels. Necromancers chanted in harmony with witching covens whose territories had been soaked in each other's blood for centuries. All united by a single terrifying realization the child Alara carried would not merely herald a new age, it would end theirs. They fear extinction, Cassius whispered, the pieces of cosmic horror falling into place with sickening clarity. Every prophecy speaks of transformation, of old powers giving way to new. They see the child not as a tool to be claimed, but as the instrument of their collective doom. Seraphina's Dhampir warriors had drawn their blessed weapons, but even their hybrid nature seemed inadequate against the supernatural tsunami bearing down upon them. The blood oaths provide some protection, she said, though her voice carried none of its earlier confidence. But not enough. Not against this. The castle shuddered as something immense struck its outer walls. Not a physical impact, but a psychic assault that bypassed stone and mortar to tear at the very concept of sanctuary. Cassius felt his ancient stronghold's defenses crumbling like sand before a hurricane, 3 centuries of careful preparation rendered meaningless in moments. "Elara!" He spun toward her, but the sight that greeted him drove all other concerns from his mind. She knelt on the cold stone floor, one hand clutched against her swollen belly, her face contorted with agony that had nothing to do with approaching childbirth. The child within her was responding to the convergence of hostile forces, its prophetic nature blazing like a beacon that drew their enemies with inexorable force. It's fighting them," she gasped, her grey eyes wide with pain and wonder. "The child is trying to protect us, but it's still too young to—" Her words dissolved into a scream as another wave of supernatural assault crashed against them. This time, Cassius felt something he had not experienced in 300 years of existence, genuine terror, not fear for his own unlife, but absolute horror at the prospect of failing in his protection oath. Gorga burst into the hall, his weathered face pale with news that promised only greater catastrophe. "My lord, the mountain passes. They're sealed. Some kind of barrier. Nothing can get through. We're trapped." The tactical implications struck Cassius like a physical blow. His enemies had not merely come to claim or destroy the child. They had come to ensure that no witness survived to spread word of their unified action. The supernatural courts intended to eliminate every trace of the prophecy and those who would protect it. "The escape routes?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer from Gorga's expression. "All blocked, my lord. Whatever power they've woven, it extends through every path down the mountain. Even the old tunnels are sealed." Seraphina's blade sang as she drew it fully, the silver surface blazing with Dhampir fury. "Then we make our stand here. House Ravencrest does not yield to—" Her defiant words were cut short as the main hall's massive doors exploded inward, torn from their hinges by forces that existed beyond the merely physical. Through the smoking breach poured creatures that defied description, beings of shadow and flame, of twisted flesh and broken light, of nightmares given form and purpose. At their head strode a figure that made even Cassius's ancient blood run cold. Malachar the Deathless, eldest of the Elder Council. His presence radiating power that could reshape reality through will alone. "Cassius Blackthorn," the ancient vampire's voice echoed through dimensions, carrying the weight of millennia. "You have chosen poorly." The dark moment had arrived, and with it, the terrible certainty that all their preparations, all their desperate alliances, might not be enough to preserve the light growing within Elara's womb.